Welcome back to the show. It's been 2 weeks since the last episode, and I'm sorry for the lack of a heads up. I needed some time to work on a few grants to help fund Crude through 2020, but we're back on schedule now. So thank you for your patience. On to this week's episode. In this one, I have a conversation with Olympian and climate activist Callan Chythlook-Sifsof. Callan's life has been a mixture of snowboarding, social justice, and climate change. She was raised in Aleknagik, Alaska, a village of about 300, just outside Dillingham. Aleknagik, like Dillingham, is a community that relies on fishing and is located near Pebble Mine. So Callan has been around the Pebble Mine controversy since it began, which led to her early involvement in activism. Alongside that activism, she's worked as a professional snowboarder, competing in the Olympics, as well as medaling in many endemic competitions. In 2011, she started working with Protect Our Winters, also known as POW, as a climate ambassador. Since then, she has presented on climate awareness and spoken to Congress about climate awareness. In 2014, she unofficially retired from professional snowboarding after 3 back-to-back knee surgeries leading up to the Sochi Olympics, and then injured her knee during the qualifying Olympic season. She is currently the head coach for the Park City Boardercross Team. Okay, here's where I give the company men a shout out. These are the people who have subscribed to the Crude Patreon for $50 or more. Trina Duber, Seward Brewing Company, The Grind Coffee Shop in Juneau, Derek Adolph, Blue and Gold Board Shop, Sharon Liska, Alaska Surf Adventure, and the newest company man, Aquila Space. Thank you to all the Patreon subscribers. This podcast wouldn't be possible without you. If you subscribe to the Crude Magazine Patreon, thank you. Your money helps keep these conversations going. So if you enjoy these conversations, you can subscribe at www.patreon.com/Crude Magazine. That's patreon.com/Crude Magazine. And pick the subscription tier that works for you. Okay, back to Callan Chythlook-Sifsof. Looking at Callan's life, she's always fought against injustice. She's always been on the side of the underrepresented and the disadvantaged. She knows that, to achieve success, you need to be mindful of all the small decisions along the way. She understands that change can be slow and meandering, which is why patience is important. She says that, as humans, we can get very narrow and very linear. And the reality is, you can't do anything if you have a linear perspective, because it's just not the truth of our world. So here she is, Callan Chythlook-Sifsof.
This red light right here, it means we're recording.
Okay, fired up.
Crude conversations. Listen more, then you talk.
Go to work!
We are recording, Callan.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show. I'm really excited to talk to you. I've been doing hours and hours of research on you.
I'm afraid to hear what you found out, but looking forward to the interview.
All good things. All good things. So your Instagram handle is Callan the Great.
It is.
Is there a story behind that?
No, there's not a real story. So the early part of my career, I didn't really have social media kind of at my disposal. And then halfway through, I just kind of thought of an Instagram handle. Actually, I think it might have been kind of copied from a World Cup athlete from Sweden or something like that. But yeah, no real story, just kind of picked it.
Just kind of picked it. Okay, well, that's great.
Yeah.
So to drop into this, earlier this week, we were texting and you told me that you spoke at a congressional hearing a few months ago on behalf of Protect Our Winters and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that was kind of an opportunity that was thrown together last minute. So POW was invited to have a delegation of people come to DC to talk and speak at this congressional hearing. And so basically, I think a number of names were kind of thrown in the mix. And then I was invited by Representative Holland from New Mexico. And so she's currently the chairwoman of that committee. And so, yeah, it was a super big honor. I was really kind of nervous leading up to it. And so, yeah, and so actually I had a whole script that I was working from and ended up just kind of speaking off the cuff the whole congressional hearing. And it went really well. Yeah, it was a good opportunity just to kind of highlight the fact that I'm from Alaska and also have a personal tie to protection of the refuge, but also just kind of on a global scale and in terms of winter sports industries and then just as humanity in general, it's imperative that we kind of stop our fossil fuel extraction before it's too late and before the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere continues to climb every year. And the more we extract, the more we're guaranteed to increase those numbers. So yeah, a really good opportunity to kind of speak from a lens of being Alaska Native and kind of how important the land is for us as Indigenous people, and then also as a snowboarder traveling the world, and how important it is seeing globally that changing snowpack and how it affects our sport, our economy, our industries. So kind of it was, yeah, really cool to tie all those pieces in.
What was that experience like? Were they receptive to what you were saying?
Yeah, I think I first started working with POW about 2011 or 12. And back then, climate change, if you said you believed in climate change or spoke to the topic, it was almost kind of taboo in all circles. Back then, you kind of were labeled as like a liberal, radical. And now every year, I think we're getting closer and closer to a place where we can all talk about it in a realistic way, where it doesn't have any tropes or it doesn't mean you're a Republican or a liberal, that we can all kind of start to talk about this as a real phenomenon. And, after that, it yields itself to doing something about this so we can change our world. But yeah, it's crazy how much different, like the climate is in politics right now. It's actually pretty cool. There was a little bit of pushback. I think there was one senator that kind of read his remarks and they were very much pro extraction. But other than that, there was just a huge amount of support across the board from that committee.
And so you said that there seems to be a lot of support now. Have you seen anything happen as the result of that, or does it just kind of seem like maybe a facade, like they're on board in front of you, but then when it's time for action, they don't deliver?
It's like such a complex, all these mechanisms are very complex in our politics. And so, that particular hearing was a House hearing. And so I think in general from House politicians, there's a lot more like of a tie to community and an ability to speak to that level of our political system, where they can understand your emotional tie to the land. They can understand because they're local politics more so than they are national politics. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, we kind of expected a lot of support and. But then as soon as, it goes up the chain, things become a lot more complex. But I was happy that we actually that measure passed. And so after that hearing, it did pass. But as you guys know, or as everyone knows, there's many different steps and parts and pieces to how these things happen. So
for sure. There are a lot of climate change deniers out there. What do you think needs to happen for those deniers to become believers?
Yeah, that's like a super hard question, but I think outreach and the more organizations like POW and individuals kind of connect into organizations like this, the more we're having conversations about these topics. And so that's as slow as it gets, but that's, I think, about as good as it gets right now, is just continue to talk about it. I remember at a POW summit, a Protect Our Winners summit one year, I'd heard Jeremy Jones say kind of a line about how dangerous the pursuit of perfection is. And we're kind of talking about as athletes, how we can talk about these things, climate change, the importance of getting off of fossil fuels as a whole in this world. And then how, sometimes hypocritical it is to be traveling the world while you're saying everyone should stop using fossil fuels. And what it comes down to, I think, is Jeremy is totally right. The pursuit of perfection, and people kind of waiting to talk about climate change because they're like, well, I snow machine all year and I work on the slope, so I have to deny that it's happening because of the way I live my life. And the reality is, we're all reliant on fossil fuels right now. And, I like to snow machine and waste gas a lot of the time, but that doesn't mean that it's not very important. We all talk about climate and what we should be doing individually every year. So that's kind of, I think, the most valuable lesson that POW offers, is that we're all trying, we're all talking. Jeremy's not a scientist. He did the best he could, and he put together this nonprofit, and it's really taken up some wheels. And now we have, a political action fund, and then we have, a coalition of scientists. And so for me, it's been really motivating and super positive to see such a breadth of different types of people working together, from politicians that work with POW to athletes that work with POW from all different backgrounds, liberal, less liberal, hunters, anglers, snowboarders. And there's really no way to solve this problem of climate without having every different type of demographic talking about this stuff.
I think that's super encouraging, what you said, Jeremy Jones says, which is how dangerous the pursuit of perfection is. Because I think that more often than not, we can get too caught up in the end result, right? As opposed to the journey.
Yeah, totally. I fully agree. And the reality is, if we all wait, like for me, I went to Finland a couple months ago, and I felt kind of weird about it. I was like, well, I just had a congressional hearing where I talked about the imperative to curb fossil fuels, and still I'm traveling. And that's really what it comes down to. Like, we have to make incremental changes in our life. And if everyone just stops and is like, oh, dude, I can't talk about climate because I'm going to Africa next month, then none of us are going to talk about it, So, yeah.
Well, it's like being on a diet or starting a diet. You have to do it in small steps. You can't just cut out all the meat if you want to be a vegetarian. You have to do it in steps.
Right. True. And then there's another part and component to it, which is kind of that's my personal kind of ethics on the issue itself. But, not speaking for POW here, but in my opinion, the impact, it's not just an opinion, there's a lot of data behind it, especially coming out of the Yale Climate Connections campaign. And that can be found online, but essentially there's a lot of data that shows the difference between individuals' carbon impact and the difference between industrial carbon impact. And so we can see the imprint of our industries of mining, fossil fuel extraction. There's just a astronomically higher level that affects our planet coming from industry than from individual use. So anyway.
No, that's great. I think that's something that a lot of people, including myself, that I just don't consciously think of. Because when I think of climate change, it's kind of like a personal issue for me all of a sudden. Like, I need to stop driving so much. I need to stop buying single-use plastic,
True, which is totally valid and 100% we all do need to be doing. But at the same time realizing all these different nuances. I think as now I'm getting kind of philosophical, but as humans, we can kind of get really narrow and very, very linear. And the reality is you can't do anything if you have a linear perspective, because it's just not the truth of our world. We have so many complexities, hypocrisies, and they're all important to hold, you know?
I think that's great. We can't have a linear perspective. I mean, when you're going through life, you're constantly changing and evolving. You may have, say, started out college or gotten into college from a certain perspective, like I want this goal, I want to be a doctor. But you're thinking about that journey as linear rather than like non-linear. You know, you're going to take a right, you're going to take a hard left, and eventually you're going to reach that end point. That end point is never going to look like how you imagined it would.
Exactly, yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, and it's been actually cool to see in terms of people kind of realizing these nuances. The positive note of it is the last couple of years, in my opinion, I've seen huge changes. And last summer, I was actually invited to go with POW to the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco. And during that time, basically, I mean, we were just attending these meetings. Most of them were very kind of high-level meetings with kind of politicians, banks from all over the world, kind of every different part and piece to the conversation you can imagine. And then all the way down to like tribes from the Amazon, tribes from all over the world speaking to their perspectives. And it was pretty flooring for me to listen to and kind of go from one room when there was the CEOs of Deutsche Bank and like major banks around the world talking about what they're doing to mitigate things and to listen to parts of our global climate community. And then you'd go to the next room and there was a tribe from the Amazon with people listening to their perspective on that, and then the CEO of Starbucks. So just like a fascinating kind of window into like how these conversations are happening right now.
Did anything stick out to you in maybe the difference or similarities between an Amazon culture talking to a more like Western culture or company like Starbucks?
Yeah. So it was funny. I don't know how accurate this is. This is all just kind of my perspective during that couple months. But I've worked with POW kind of for quite a while now, and I haven't ever heard the call for Indigenous voices to be heard, really, up until the last few years. I've always kind of honestly probably held my Indigenous part of myself a little bit underneath my snowboard side of myself, just by the nature of it, just because I'm in this circle and I'm more of a snowboarder here than I am an Indigenous person. But it was crazy at the Climate Action Summit how almost every session, the highest levels, people were using these kind of buzzwords of we need to listen to Indigenous cultures that have been protecting the planet for millennia. And so, and I know that's a kind of nuanced, that's a whole different ball of wax that we can talk about and kind of deconstruct. But it was so powerful for me to hear, even at the one with the Starbucks CEO in it, he was actually talking to an Indigenous person on the panel. Anyway, it's just the conversation is evolving every year. And for me, that was the coolest part, was to kind of I actually see leaders from the Gwich'in tribe speaking to the crowd. Mm-hmm. And then seeing, those people in the crowd speaking about the Gwich'in person they heard talk. And anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but
no, this is great. I like this. I like where this is going.
Yeah. But yeah, so it was. I think more and more we're kind of getting a little bit smarter in the world with internet and the amount of information we have at our disposal. So we really can learn about these other ways of living, these other policies, these other technologies that we can utilize And in order to get out of the climate change crisis we're in, we have to kind of all connect uniformly, you know?
I want to get back to something you said just now. We need to listen to these indigenous cultures is something that we're realizing. Maybe we can kind of unpack that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a really complex topic in and of itself, especially in Alaska, all across the nation and the world, actually. And well, my partner right now, she's studying environmental policy at Berkeley right now in a PhD program. And so her kind of lens focuses on critical race theory. And so her stuff is way more in depth than my lens, but it has been kind of incredible to watch where academia is headed with kind of deconstructing race in our country and our world. In Alaska, we all kind of know that we have many different native corporations that kind of stand for a different thing. And in America specifically, and in Alaska, we have a really interesting intersection of politics and race, and politics and indigenous topics like land, reservations, native allotment, subsistence rights. And so in Alaska, in my opinion, it's kind of a chaos for me. I think we have a lot of different mechanisms at play with native corporations all across the state and politics that are maybe not the most healthy. But that's, everyone's got a different opinion about that kind of stuff. But in the end, I think at our roots, at my culture's roots, the Yupik people, I can really only speak for myself, but I was taught my entire life, and my grandpa didn't speak English till he was 10 years old. And a place like Aleknagik, Alaska, and Dillingham, Alaska, where I grew up, these places still have fluent Yupik speakers on a daily basis all over. And people are taught to pay attention to the land, pay attention to all these little nuances of where berries grow each summer in relation to the previous summer. And these are things you grow up kind of as just a normal part of your existence of recognizing. And oftentimes I feel that's something we share in the outdoor community. And when I'm with people with Protect Our Winters, oftentimes it feels similar to like the people I grew up with, where at the core of this group, you've spent your entire life outside and you've spent your entire life undeniably watching these environmental factors just over the course of many, many years. And you can't separate it. As a result, you have a deep connection to your surroundings and the mountains and the rivers around you. Mm-hmm. So for me, while you can't generalize, you can't quite say like, oh, all indigenous people are environmentalists. The truth is, at the root of these cultures, that is what we represent.
So as we've gotten farther from the land as humans, what do you think that does to us?
Yeah, I think it's our environment's everything. Like if you put me in New York City for 5 years, I might be a whole different person. I might stop hiking all the time and start liking, whatever it is. But just being aware, it's imperative. We can't separate ourselves from the environment because this is where we live. And maybe it's kind of an older thought process of like national parks are over there, and then we live in the city and we go on our 2-week vacation once a year to see them. That's kind of an old thought. I think we're kind of evolving out of this compartmentalizing our environment. I think we're starting to realize that hiking is in our backyard and it's not a national park that you take your kids on an RV park to. It's something that's here, like right outside our house,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Well, and I think in Alaska, we kind of, I don't know about most other people, but when I first came down here to the lower 48, I was kind of blown away. I was like 15 and was in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, which is quote unquote, the Wild West. And I was like, dude, there's strip malls everywhere. This is not wild at all. And so, yeah, up in Alaska, I think we do have a real tie to that stuff, and our politics kind of pushes and pulls our progress, but we understand how wild things can be up there.
And I think that gets to the difference in the relationship people have with nature. So nature is constantly around us in Alaska, whereas if you go to New York, it's pretty far away. And so when we're talking about these issues of climate change, of, receding shoreline, things like that, it is completely foreign to, say, someone from New York, for example.
That's true. That's really true. And actually, that's why I'm thankful to people like the people that work for Protect Our Winters and people like you. But Protect Our Winters do a really good job of kind of highlighting these things. For me, it's kind of tedious to hear like these rationales in a marketing format where it's like, look at what we can do. Where I'm like, dude, we all know we can be doing more. Why isn't everyone doing things? And they kind of take up the action of showing these people, these folks from New York that maybe go skiing in Aspen once a year, illustrating to them how important this is. If their only outdoor experience is skiing, a couple times a year, if that's their thing, like that's a real way that they can key into a changing climate, So.
And since we're talking about the difference in relationships with nature, I was thinking we could probably talk about your village, Aleknagik.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is a village of about 200, right?
Yep, a little, maybe like 300. Yeah, 200 to 300 people.
And it's only accessible by boat and plane.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little community just outside of Dillingham, which most people would know through commercial fishing. Dillingham's a pretty big hub for salmon fishing. And so we just live about 30 miles north of Dillingham. And so basically out there, it's native allotment land. So, for example, my whole family was granted native allotment along this stretch of road. So basically, I just grew up out there with all my family along our road. And actually, I can speak to how I got into snowboarding a little bit. Was my big brother was super into snowboarding and watched like all the TB videos. And I didn't know what any of that stuff meant. I was just that was all snowboarding was to me, my brother and his videos,
Mm-hmm.
And there was no chairlifts out there, and we just kind of snow machine up and down mountains, hike around. And so I didn't actually get on a chairlift till I was like 13 and moved to Girdwood.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So basically out there, it's a pretty intact indigenous community. And, I don't think a lot of people from Anchorage or Fairbanks really have a chance to get out to those communities very often, but actually the culture is pretty intact, and there's a lot of different problems, just like many other indigenous communities around the world. But the reality is there's so much culture that's so valuable and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And a part of that is, you're kind of, by necessity, you have to be subsistence hunting for your food. There's a grocery store there, but things are super expensive. So you pretty much have to kind of be self-sufficient out there. And right now there's a pretty big opposition going on to the Pebble Mine, which is, if built, it would be the world's largest open pit copper and gold mine. But most people already know plenty about the Pebble Mine. And this has been a saga going on since I was little, since I was like 10 years old. And only in the last like 10 years has it gotten really big publicity, thanks to people like POW and Protect Our Winters. But the indigenous people out there have done such an incredible job of opposing this with everything they got. And it's still a very real possibility. And so I think we're all watching right now and just trying to do as much as we can to talk about the downsides of this mine.
How would Pebble Mine affect Aleknagik?
So it would affect, on a long term, the entire region of that area. It would affect the whole salmon population, because watersheds are extremely fragile. They're tundra, and they're Arctic environments, which are like enormously more fragile and hard to keep intact than nearly any other place in the world. And so the ramifications of these tailing ponds leaching into the watershed is huge. And just hands down, there's absolutely no reason for this mine to go through other than foreign interests like this Canadian mining company. It's about money and it's about industry. It's not about the people, and it's not what the people want,
Mm-hmm.
So.
And circling back around to climate change, do you know how climate change is affecting the village?
In our area, yeah, there's coastal erosion all over the place. So that's one that probably any coastline in Alaska is experiencing, and you can see all over, even if it's on a small scale, not quite as dramatic as, moving a village, but you can see that. For me, the most direct visual sign was this summer. And the last 2 summers, the salmon run has been pretty healthy, but halfway through the season, the temps were so high that these salmon were experiencing like heart attacks and strokes from the heat of the water. And so even though, everybody in the first part of the season was like, yeah, there's a good run, like having a good run of salmon doesn't mean anything if the water is too warm for them to survive in,
Mm-hmm.
So.
That's crazy. That's something that you would not think about. I mean, not you, but the universal. Remember, I was talking about relationships with nature. I was born and raised in Alaska, and I would never think of a fish having a heart attack or a stroke.
I know, man. It's weird. I thought someone was joking with me when they told me that. I was like, doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Well, and that's actually a good sign. Like, I feel like these signifiers that we can see in our world sometimes get adulterated by like the media and public perception and politics. And that's kind of a good example is, the importance of seeing multiple sides of a topic like the salmon run. You could easily get on a tip and say, hey, this is the biggest salmon run throughout history, so therefore the salmon are not in jeopardy. Or you can look at it and be like, okay, well, there's plenty of different parts and pieces to the story, and we can't just rely on one. Anyway, that I feel like that's relatable to kind of how we hear climate change in the media, and kind of like, well, no, look, we just got a huge dump of snow last week, so the climate change isn't real. And that's just stupid. It's ignorance, because there's such a bigger picture to it,
Well, I think that a little bit of what that speaks to, and I'm going to totally butcher this, but there's this philosophical theory. I don't remember the name of it, but it's this idea that we as individuals care more about, say, a pinprick on our own fingers, because that is immediate pain to our personal being, rather than, say, some mass genocide in a country away from us.
That makes sense. Yeah, totally, for sure. Like, just it has to hit home for us, otherwise it doesn't absorb.
Exactly. So what happens when climate change radically affects the livelihood of a small village?
Well, yeah, for fishing, that's pretty devastating. I mean, Dillingham, the entire town of Dillingham relies on the salmon population. There's no other industry out there. And that industry has helped bring money into the state, from commercial fishermen coming up here in a mass migration every year to just every part and piece. That's a really valuable industry for us. And it's actually not just us. The native population and local people make up like half of the fishery. So it's also a lot of other outside people that make their living off of this industry as well. But for the people on the ground, it's huge. Losing this livelihood, it affects the fact that you can't eat the fish you're catching all year round. If the salmon population changes, that's an actual diet that we lose. And so food, navigation when the rivers don't freeze up, like this last couple months, the rivers haven't frozen in Aleknagik, the place I grew up in. And so you can't make runs to and from other villages for groceries. You can't like make crossings that would be like a 30-mile trip. Instead, you have to go all the way around for a 100-mile trip. And so there's little things like that really do affect the entirety of living out there. What it comes down to is if there's no industry for people to make money in the summer, there's not enough jobs to make up for that loss of income.
I was talking to, he's a Arctic Youth Ambassador.
Okay.
His name is Eben Hobson, and he lives in Utqiagvik.
Oh yeah, I think I've heard about him, but I'm not sure.
He was telling me this year that they hadn't gotten a whale, so they had to keep going out farther and farther and farther, and I think it got to as far as like 60 miles.
Oh my God.
Out there.
Wow.
And that was because of melting sea ice.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, it probably affects more than we can even like ponder. When it comes down to it, none of us quite know what's going to happen next year and what we'll see from the salmon next year.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the worst case scenarios are actually pretty low consequence compared to what actually happens in the next like 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
So anyway. So
when you speak at events, do you have any anecdotes or personal experiences that you share?
Yeah, I haven't been speaking quite as much as I used to be. And since retirement, I've focused on coaching quite a bit. So I've stepped a little bit back from public appearances and stuff. But I typically, when I used to do that, I would I didn't quite have a template. I just kind of, for every event, speak to something different.
Could you give me an example?
Oh, yeah. Well, I did a lot of speeches to indigenous organizations and then like schools in rural Alaska, like Bethel. And so when I'd go out there, basically I just kind of tell my story. I tell my history of where I grew up and the different parts and pieces that led me to being on the Olympic team. Actually, it's pretty similar to our conversation now. I think I try to highlight as best I can the fact that truly, it's not false humility here, but truly any one of us can make the Olympic team. And it's truly about the steps and the parts and pieces that happen and the little small decisions you make along the way and every day and every month that lead to that. And so actually that's pretty similar to the climate conversation, where it's not some like magical thing we can change with like technology to take carbon out of the atmosphere, but we can do things individually on a day-to-day basis in politics, on our individual lives, with this in mind,
Yeah.
But yeah, basically I just kind of talk about my life story and piece it out where people can see each step that happened in order to get there.
Which is great, because I think that it gets back to what you were saying about the internet and how it's made the world such a smaller place.
That's true, yeah.
Somebody in like Guatemala can see what is happening in Aleknagik.
Yeah, that's very true.
And so it makes us feel a lot closer.
Mm-hmm, that's true. Yeah. And I guess stepping off of the climate thing and more about kind of like sports or all that, actually, I think that's what's cool about our modern world now. We still have some kitschy stuff on NBC and the Olympic Channel that kind of put heroic Olympians, which is great. There's a lot of real hard work that goes into doing this, but at the same time, it's cool that we can get a chance to see some other parts and pieces of athletes that we look up to and see like the more human parts of people, Absolutely.
And I think that maybe to the average person, the snowboarder may not seem like an intelligent person.
Ha, that's true.
And this is coming from a snowboarder.
Yeah.
And so I think hearing someone like yourself, it throws people off and like, oh my gosh, like she's extremely intelligent. She knows
Aw,
exactly what
thank you.
she's talking about.
Thanks, man. You're too nice. No, I appreciate that though. That is true. Like, man, just because all these, I think that's a generational thing too that's changing. I think like 80s, 90s, to me, my perception of that is kind of like everything is kitschy and like snowboarders are this way and skateboarders are this way and like a cowboy's like this and a oil worker's like this. And I think more and more we're kind of stepping out of our parents' tropes with all that stuff, you know? And really, our generation, I don't think we have a lot of like, oh, snowboarders are dumb, dude. We're like, nah, dude, my friend who's professional snowboarder goes to Harvard. So it's like, yeah.
By kitschy, you mean like stereotypes, like we're rising above the stereotypes.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're getting a little bit further from these like, stereotypes.
We're getting smarter.
Yeah. Hopefully, dude.
Yeah, every day I hope people pick up a book and actually read the whole thing.
Yeah, dude. Well, me too, actually. Like, and that's the thing is like constant learning. We should never get to a place where anyone is sure that they know everything, you know? Like we're all constantly getting a little smarter in our world, progressing, and that's beautiful. We don't all have to have the answers right now. We all have to be learning.
I interviewed a pastor a while back, a pastor from my childhood, and he said something that was weirdly reinforcing to a thought that I had that I thought was original. And he said something to the effect that the most dangerous people in the world are the ones that think they know everything.
Dude, so true. I agree with that 100%. Yeah, I that's actually a hallmark of kind of my indigenous culture too that I've always appreciated is like a humility is a really important thing in life. And I think Trump's like a pretty great example of that right now is we can all be in our own little bubble, super egotistical, out for our life and our house and what we want and our truck and our job, but that's not the reality of living on this planet. We can't all do that.
At the end of the day, we're not going to be stoked about, you know, like the Ford Raptor we bought. We're going to be stoked about, you know, the relationships we built and the things that we have accomplished.
Yeah, 100%.
So can you tell me about your transition from being a snowboarder to climate advocacy?
Yeah, for sure. It was kind of an accident. I didn't intend to at all. But the Pebble Mine was something that was really close to home. And if you're from that area, you kind of can't get away from in some way being a part of the opposition. That's just, there's too few people. Everyone is kind of a part of it. And so back then I had worked with a few different local little nonprofits that were trying to oppose the mine. And I would just do whatever I could, from like lending my picture to be on this flyer, to just whatever I could if there was an opportunity. And I got an opportunity to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times in 2011. And that was a pretty big thing that just kind of just materialized. It didn't I think we had been working on it for like a month beforehand, but then as soon as that was published, I think that was the first time POW had reached out to me and then invited me to be an ambassador. And then from that point, I had definitely involved myself a lot more through POW with environmental things all across the board, from like fossil fuel extraction to the climate march to any of the number of things they do. But then in addition, I've always kind of been like on the radical side of liberal politics, probably. And like I have a huge family of people with many different political views, and I'm not like a staunch liberal by any means, but I'm definitely on the more radical side of things. And so I've always gone to protests. Like I've lived in Salt Lake City for 7 years. And so have kind of, my circle of friends is into social justice and activism and stuff like that. So over the last like 7 years, I've just kind of put my spare time to like being a part of these different things. And so it's not that I'm like an activist, quote unquote. It's just, I think it's kind of funny when people use that term, like I'm an activist. But the reality is we all have an opinion about our world, and we don't need to be labeled as anything. It's just everyone should be talking about stuff, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the people who think that they are not advocates of something have been told that they aren't.
True.
And they subscribe to maybe a political leaning or something else that
true.
Has told them that they're fine with the status quo.
Right. 100%. Yeah. But yeah, overall, I care about the environment. And if I have a platform to use and people want to highlight that, I'm 100% willing to do whatever I can.
Was there a moment when you were like, I need to get involved with this? And it seems like that started with Pebble Mine.
It definitely was Pebble Mine. That was just like such a behemoth, like just the power, like especially with a community like the Bristol Bay region and a native corporation that also opposes it. You know, a lot of times in Alaska, we can get into these contentious arguments with like, oh, that tribe wants oil drilled there, or no, that tribe is not opposed to that mine. But I think why my call to do something about Pebble, which there's a lot more people that have done way more to oppose this than I have. That was just a really small thing that I did. But the reason why it was so important was because a lot of times the conversation gets clouded by this rhetoric about Native populations wanting something or not wanting something, or who gets money out of this or who doesn't. And for this particular case study, it's clear the power that these mining companies have. It's kind of like this really interesting example of, even with local opposition, with nationwide opposition, with worldwide opposition, with literally to the point where like Patagonia is doing international campaigns against this, and huge efforts to lobby against this mine on a Alaska scale, on a nationwide scale. The amount of effort to stop this mine is so incredibly huge, and the amount of people that support the opposition is huge. And still it's on the table. And to see our local democracy fail, and see our modern politics literally trump anything at a local level that people do or do not want, it's just like angry making. You know, it's so clear how this mine should not happen. It's so clear. And yet it continues to be pushed for at the highest level of politics, all the way up to Trump, you know?
What are people that advocate for the mine saying?
Most of it relies on like economic impacts and claims of job opportunities. And that, I don't know the exact concrete numbers, but the job opportunity actually is not quite as like big as those that talk about it. But actually, I don't actually know many people that are championing the mine. I think, as far as my lens is, and I no longer live in Alaska right now, but it seems that it's more of a political and industrial thing, and I don't know many people that are actually thinking this would bring jobs to the region, you know.
Mm-hmm. And even if it did, what we'd be dealing with is short-term effects versus long-term effects, right?
Exactly.
So short-term effects, there's going to be this big boom in jobs for a short amount of time, but in the long term, there's going to be no fish.
Right.
And it's going to totally devastate an entire culture in that area.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly well said. Totally.
So getting back to snowboarding really quick.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I got out of snowboarding was because at a certain point, I felt like it was selfish. Like the act of snowboarding itself is to bring me personal joy. And to have left something for me that I felt was a little selfish and frivolous to doing, say, these podcasts where I'm talking to someone like you, who we're talking about climate change. You know, we're talking about Pebble Mine. Like, these are real issues that affect people on a larger scale than just me personally. You know, this is everyone's livelihood, not even happiness, rather than, you know, I got that first descent.
Right. Totally. Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I've definitely experienced all those same mechanisms you're talking about. I spent almost 10 years on the team and on the US team, and it felt extremely important to me, and it you know, it's will always be important to me, but yeah, you kind of mature and you grow and you see many different things to do in the world, and it does start to feel a little bit selfish of focusing on yourself. But for me, I honestly did my whole career. I kind of did feel like a need to represent my Native community, and that kind of made it a lot easier for me to engage on the World Cup, and like made it like kind of made things make sense in my brain for why I was there at each event. But yeah, it was a huge game changer for me to involve myself with Protect Our Winners, and definitely felt like a little bit of kind of reality check of we can focus on ourselves all we want, but the reality is there's a lot more going on in the world that we need to pay attention to right now, you know?
Weren't you the first Alaska Native to be in the Olympics?
I was, yeah. Yeah, and that's unofficial. I don't know. I think like it's pretty certain, but I don't think that there's any known blood quantum from Inuit people. We'll say it that way.
And, you know, looking at it from that perspective, I think that it makes your involvement in snowboarding a lot less frivolous than, say, mine.
Oh, no.
Well, because I think that you have other Alaska Native boys and girls looking up to you. And when you have someone that is like you doing something, you're like, I can do that. I
really appreciate that, Cody. Yeah. I think that kind of fed my career for a long time. And actually, just to be honest, I had my brother was shot just a few months ago in August out at fish camp in rural Alaska, and so he was shot with an AR-15. And to be honest, like my experience as a Native person has been really similar to, I'm sure, a lot of people out there in these little rural villages. I think you're exposed to quite a lot. You're exposed to this beautiful side of our culture that is hard to put into words. It's one of the most important things in my life, my culture. But then there's also this very real side of poverty and strife and like struggle. And so that's something that like I experienced my whole life, that realness of what goes on in some villages with alcohol abuse and all kinds of different stuff. And so for me, I got a lot of strength from my community, and parts of my career where I really did feel like quitting. And I was able to kind of gain some strength from my community. So for me, those boys and girls that listen to me speak are as much important in my life as I hope I was in theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And is your brother okay?
Sorry, Cody. I wasn't going to bring that up. Sorry.
Okay, it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, no, he's okay. But
good. I'm glad to hear that.
Here, I'll say that again, so I'm not crying on the air. Sorry.
No, you're totally good, and we can move on. I have
it's
other
okay.
questions.
No, it's all right. No, this was good, but no, and you don't have to include that in it if it's kind of a weird tidbit too. But if it was helpful, feel free to. But yeah, no, he's totally okay now. But that's kind of, there's a lot of real things that people in these villages experience, and yeah, I hope to allow people to see some of these lenses in my life, kind of.
You know what I think of in moments like that, where you're away from your family and you're away from your loved ones when something like that happens, when something potentially tragic, and you want to be there to support your family, is when you are in Salt Lake, do you feel like, and when you're doing these talks and climate advocacy, do you feel like you are championing your home and your people?
Yeah, I really do. And I think I'm such a small piece. Like my impact is as much as I can do at any given time, but it's still a really small piece that I can lend. But I do kind of feel a need. I've spent quite a lot of my life away from my community and competing and snowboarding, and I do feel kind of an imperative that I engage in that way. So yeah, I always keep Alaska close to my heart wherever I'm at, and try to. I'm an Alaskan no matter where I live. So in the end, just try to lend my voice as well.
That's really great. I had a conversation with Jesse Bertner a while back, and I asked him about when he moved to Seattle from Alaska. He moved out of Alaska, and he said something along the lines of exactly what you said, is you export your culture. You are a representative of Alaska.
I like that. That's totally fitting because, there's a lot of us that kind of relocate. And I held on to my Alaska ID for as long as I could, actually. I just got a new ID last year.
It makes you unique. No matter where you move to, if you're Alaskan, people call you Alaska.
Yeah, it's true, right? They do. Yeah, it's kind of, we do. Going back to the climate thing, actually, that it's true. We all probably do have this kind of unique tie to seeing what Alaska is. And even if you move away, if you've been there, you've been there, So 100%. I like that.
So if it's okay with you, I'd like to talk a little about when you came out publicly as gay.
Yeah, for sure.
So you came out during the 2014 Olympics in Sochi, Russia, in support of the protests against the Olympics being in Russia because of their anti-gay laws.
Right. That's true, yeah.
What was the result of coming out publicly in that way?
For me, actually, I haven't experienced any negativity really in my life about coming out in 2014, or I was kind of publicly out to people that I knew, not on a not in like a format like on ESPN like I did in 2014, but everyone that was around me kind of knew more or less that I was gay, and I haven't honestly experienced anything bad. I think there was a little bit of backlash when there was an Anchorage Daily News story about it, and I think a few people were like, "Mind your business. You're a snowboarder. We don't care what you have to think." But overall, it was a really good response, and I had really good support from the U.S. team with that piece. And then, I don't think probably didn't surprise most people actually, but yeah, overall, really, really good support about that whole thing. And for me, about being an activist, quote unquote, or whatever that means, I have just always felt like I needed to lend my truth. And so it's not like I intentionally was trying to do any pieces along the way, from the Pebble Mine activism to POW to being outspoken about the Russian LGBT laws. It's not intentional. It just kind of, I've always said yes and engaged with lending my truth to a situation. And for that ESPN piece, for me, I really had a problem with the idea of being somewhere and then, as a rule of the place where I'm at, having to silence my truth. For me, that was probably the one thing I can't stand, is silencing my truth. So, yeah.
You know, I just thought of this. It seems like in the research that I've done and the reading that I've done online and the things that I've watched, and then now having talked to you, you have this like multi-dimensional like identity, right? Like when somebody looks at you, they're not going to be like, oh, there's the gay snowboarder.
Yeah,
you know, they're not going to think that. But for a lot of people, being gay is their identity.
That's true. Yeah, that is true. Yeah, it's interesting. I've always, I haven't like really held tight to any one of my identities. That's definitely like, now I'm getting philosophical again, but kind of my ethos, if I have one, is like trying to not deny any one part of myself or hold on or latch on to one of them, but hold them all collectively. That's kind of my strategy for going through life. So,
do you know where that comes from?
Maybe my culture. I can't say for sure that that's where it comes from, but we definitely, like the Yupik culture, as far as I've been taught from my grandpa, my family, and we're kind of traditionally nomadic family culture. So each, you know, you might hear other Native people say that they believe a different variation of something like this, but from my family, I've always been taught about consciousness, and I guess that's my kind of interpretation of my upbringing. But the hallmark of what I've seen in my culture is consciousness and awareness. And so for me, maybe I just internalize that to myself. But yeah.
Yeah, that's great. A lot of great things.
I'm waxing poetic. Don't make me sound dumb, Cody.
No, I love poetry and philosophy.
All right.
So it's right up my alley.
All right, sweet.
So that does it for my questions. And I know that when we spoke on the phone the other day, you were like trying to think, or you told me that you were trying to think of, you know, subjects to talk about and everything. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about?
No, actually, I think that was like perfect. It was super natural, and I think we flowed into everything. That was awesome.
Well, that's great,
Yeah,
Callan.
yeah.
It's been an honor to have you on the podcast.
Man, thank you so much for having me, Cody. I appreciate it. It's funny to talk to you now too, as adults, because I have this image of you at like hiking up like the Glacier Bowl or something, but I haven't seen you since I was like 11, probably.
At Borderline Camp, you said, right?
Yeah. I just remember seeing, you know, because like I think you were pro back then, right? Or you kind of.
I was Yeah.
So I was like, kind of starstruck. I'd be like, oh, those are the pros over there.
And so how do you feel now? Because you've made it exponentially farther than I ever did.
Well, no, you know as well as I do the Olympics, and there's so many different types of snowboarding, and they're all a different trajectory, different path. So yeah.
Well, what that just reminded me of is I talked to Rosie Mancari a while back on the podcast, and she said that she wasn't excited for the Olympics as she was about the competitions on her circuit. You know, because those were about proving herself to her peers rather than just being on this worldwide stage.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I probably agree. Well, it just doesn't quite, for me, and what it felt like for me was that it didn't feel, it felt like a show. That's a good word for it. And so it's hard to really internalize your performance, especially if it's your first one, which, you know, I've only been to one, but yeah, for me, it's such a show. It's such a big thing that you're not quite ready. I'm sure your second Olympics might be a bit different, but for your first, you were such a deer in headlights on that first one. It's hard to gauge kind of performance. But yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of everything. Like, it's equally one of the biggest, like, most impressive and fulfilling moments of your life where you've like accomplished this thing that like has been an abstract, but you've been, incrementally working towards. So it's equally just grounding and flooring and mind-blowing and all of those things. And then there's a large part of it, I think, where you hold the Olympics as this big thing in your mind for so long that it probably doesn't match up to whatever you imagined it to be. That might be true for my experience, definitely. And just like anything, I'm sure if you've watched NASCAR on TV your whole life and then you go to a actual track, maybe it doesn't look so cool as it does on TV, but I'm sure it's like that with any kind of a giant event like that. There's plenty of the mundane behind the scenes that are not quite as cool as it looks on the surface,
Well, and I think that it has a lot to do with the average person's reaction to the Olympics. There's something in that name, and there's something about that, the extravagance of that event. And so you grow up thinking about or hearing from like, oh, mom and dad want to watch ice skating.
Yeah.
They want to watch the figure skating. And so that it's important to them. And so either consciously or subconsciously, you're like, it probably gets down to something like super Freudian. Like, I want to impress my parents and I want my dad to say he's proud of me.
It's true, dude. Yeah, I'm sure. But then, it's funny though, because I've talked to quite a bit of like former Olympians, and sometimes I hate it. I hate listening to us talk because it does end up sounding like a bunch of jaded Olympians talking, like, oh, but it's funny. I was just talking the other week to another coach for the place I work for, and we're kind of hating on the Olympics briefly, just about some of the more mundane and political sides of it, and then at the end of it, we couldn't help but like both smile at how, you can't relinquish the magic that it holds. And every year when it comes on, I think there's a part of me that hurts a little bit in my stomach, like, oh, I still had more to do. But you can't relinquish, no matter how cynical I get or, how much better I would have liked to perform at the Olympics I went to. That seed of magic is just impossible to quelch. Like there's a piece of me that watches the Olympics and I'm like, it's such a marketing show. It's political, but goddamn, it like moves me every time.
You just said that I feel like I had more to do. And I feel like that's a common thing with even the most successful people. True. With authors that wrote 20 books. They're like, I could have written 30 books.
Yeah, true. That's pretty true. I bet everyone kind of feels that no matter what level you're at. You're like, God damn it. If I only had another year, dude.
Well, because you hit this kind of flow state at a certain point and you're like, it just becomes natural to do it.
Yeah. It feels good. It feels like it's your golden zone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, sweet. Yeah, thank you for the conversation. This has been awesome.
For more information about how you can support local grassroots journalism, go to www.patreon.com/Crude Magazine. Crude Conversations is written, hosted, and produced by me, Cody Liska, for Crude Magazine. Music was produced by Alkota Beats.